towards diesel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to have you with us on this beautiful morning. We were worried what the good weather means for us here in the Burgtheater, but I think Boris and I are now reassured that European Discourse is in good hands, in your hands. It's the last of our three matinees for this year. When we chose the topic, we knew that it was a relevant one, but when we chose the date, we did not realize that we would not know anything about what is going to happen. Of course, as I was thinking about this historically, I thought to myself, as an Indian, I should have known. I should have known because they've done this before. They left India in 1947, of course. They were actually at that time for remaining. They did not want to leave, but my parents' and grandparents' generation asked them to leave. So they did leave, but what we should learn from this history is they left in an extremely incompetent and unruly fashion, as disorderly as again. So I think not having looked at the lessons of history on their part and on our part, and having learned nothing from it, is not a good idea. But this is a very poor consolation, because actually the subject which we want to discuss is serious. I think there are no winners in this situation. We are going to be, unfortunately, in a lose-lose proposition for all concerned. But we have four excellent speakers for this morning's discussion. My colleague Ivan Vejvoda from the IWM will moderate. I would just like to thank not only our three partners, the Burgtheater, Standard, and Erste Stiftung, in the person of Boris Marte here, for this cooperation and the chance to hold this debate. And we come back to you next year in January with the next edition of the debate. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, myself too, I want to welcome you here in the Burgtheater this morning. And of course, we're also very proud about this collaboration between the IWM, der Standard, Burgtheater, and Erste Stiftung. If you're interested what Erste Stiftung really is and you don't really know, there is a webpage, www.erstestiftung.org. So have a look. There's several stuff going on these days because we're living in very exciting times. Well, you mentioned this happened already before. This reminded me of something, because if you're interested to stay in the Burgtheater the whole day, but maybe, you know, in the evening they play here Liebesgeschichten und Heiratssachen. It kind of fits, huh? I mean, this was never something like a Liebesheirat between them, right? So, but as you said that this happened already before, it also reminded me of something. Es ist alles uralt, nur in anderer Gestalt. Huh? You know from Nestor, and those who know Nestor, es ist alles uralt, let's go, nur in anderer Gestalt. Huh? Es ist alles uralt, nur in anderer Gestalt.
Good morning to you all. It's wonderful to see such a wonderful turnout, as Shalini said, on this beautiful early spring in Vienna. But the Burgtheater is an equally attractive venue, and I think we're all very happy when we come to this magnificent Viennese building. We're debating Europe, and as Shalini mentioned, but just let me add that I'm not only a fellow at the IWM, but I lead a project called Europe's Futures that is a strategic partnership with the Erste Foundation. And here, of course, in partnership with Der Standard, with the Burgtheater, Erste, and ourselves, we are very glad that there is this possibility to discuss, both in German and in English, these topics. This, obviously, as Shalini mentioned, is a burning topic. Nobody quite realized how burning it would be. I was listening to BBC Radio until a few minutes before I came here. April 12th, May 22nd, an MP said that Prime Minister Theresa May's time was counted in hours, days, or weeks, but we'll discuss all that. But before we do that, let me please introduce our speakers, and I'll start with Mary Kaldor here, who is to my right. Mary is a professor of global governance at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and director of the research unit on conflict and civil society. Mary, in full disclosure, is someone whom I've known for a long time, and we worked together at the University of Sussex 25 years ago at the Sussex European Institute. But along with being a professor, she's also a civic activist. For very many years, she was a founding member of the European Nuclear Disarmament and a founder and co-chair of something called the Helsinki Citizens Assembly that late President Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia then founded in 1990 with our colleague Sonja Licht. So her life has been an intertwining of those two spheres of society and politics, and she has been the author of numerous books, too numerous to be enumerated here, but just let me add that she is one of the persons who came up with the concept of new wars and has extensively written about the character of wars today, their hybrid character, and everything else that goes along with it. To my left is Tessa Szyszkowitz, who I'm sure the Austrian public knows because she is someone from here, although she has lived in many places as the correspondent of Profil, and has been correspondent in Brussels, Jerusalem, Moscow for 8 years, and now in London for more than, I think, 8 years. She is also an author and has written a book actually about Brexit. I think the only one here on the panel who's actually devoted time for a full-length book called Real Englishmen, Britain and Brexit, and numerous other books as well. To my far left, Denis Staunton, who is a correspondent and deputy editor of the Irish Times in London, and also a journalist who has traveled and been a correspondent extensively from practically every part of the Northern Hemisphere, I would say, is also on a jury of a distinguished European Journalist Prize, and obviously we really wanted to have someone from Ireland because Ireland, as we will discuss, is a very important part of the whole Brexit debate. Last but not least, Thomas Tugendhat, member of the Parliament since 2015. Before that, an officer, a colonel in the British Army, and actually, and maybe important for this audience, from a family that is Viennese, whose family left in the 1920s as fascism and Nazism were rising. The last part of his family, I was just asking him, left after Kristallnacht, and most of his family unfortunately perished in the Holocaust. So we have a Brit who's also a Viennese from Vienna, and Brno, his family. So please welcome our speakers for, I think, a very lively debate. And the first question goes to you, Tom, and we'll start sort of from a 30,000-foot view. June 23rd was something that many of us who were looking from the side were thinking is a done deal, basically that from our point of view, common sense would prevail. There's obvious reasons why being part of the European Union in a world that is challenged by the rise of China, by all sorts of other things, terror, that the British voters would decide to stay. And we were thus confronted on the evening of the 23rd with this result, 51.88% for Brexit and 48.11% to leave. What was your feeling on that day, and what was your view of the path for Britain in the lead up to the referendum?
It's a very simple one to start. I was not surprised by the result. I'd been expecting it since March that year. And the reason I'd been expecting it is because I knocked on more than 15,000 doors in the 6 months leading up to the referendum, talking to people about the choices before them. And it became very clear to me as early as March that the referendum was lost. What did surprise me was that it was lost as closely as it was. I think had it not been for the Remain campaign, it would have been 60-40 for Leave, maybe even more. But I wasn't, I mean, I was disappointed, of course, but I wasn't despairing on that day, and I still am not, because the relationship between Britain and our European partners is something that is going to endure. It has to endure. We've got to find ways to work together, and what the British people did was reject one way of cooperation, not all ways of cooperation. And the challenge now is, yes, of course, a British one, but also a European one, to find out how to make that cooperation work differently. And of course, you know, it is true that, it's obviously true that Brexit is a British phenomenon because it happened in the UK, but it's now a European challenge. And it's not as though the forces that led to Brexit are unknown in other parts of the continent. They are seen very clearly on the streets in France and Italy and Germany and many other countries too.
And just a brief follow-up question, not an easy one, of course. Was the referendum necessary?
The very fact that it passed, I think, gives you the answer. You know, the truth is, and people forget this, but the truth is that all three major political parties had promised a referendum of some kind. You know, the Liberal Democrats had been promising a referendum for the best part of 20 years. Cameron, of course, promised the referendum following the 2010 election, when the rise of UKIP in the UK got to 20-odd%, and he felt that he had to do it. And the Labour Party had been talking about a referendum as well. So, you know, it's certainly true that none of the major political parties particularly wanted it, but they all realized they had to promise it, and at some point it was therefore going to come. And one can argue quite legitimately as to whether or not the timing was good or bad or whatever, but the best chance that that referendum had of passing was under a Prime Minister who was willing to campaign for it. It would not have been impossible to imagine a Prime Minister a few years later leading a Conservative Party that was campaigning specifically to leave. So David Cameron took a risk, true, but he took a risk thinking that the circumstances were as good as they could be, and what he got wrong, his miscalculation, was that he thought reasonably that the Labour Party would campaign to remain, but Jeremy Corbyn didn't. Jeremy Corbyn deliberately sabotaged much of the Remain campaign by failing to make the case on behalf of Labour, so much so that at the end of the referendum, many Labour voters thought that the Labour Party was campaigning to leave. And that was part of it.
Thank you. Mary Kaldor, and obviously I feel you want to respond and react to that, and I'm very willing to hear your opinion on was a referendum necessary, and you know what was Labour's point of view going into the referendum. But you were yesterday at the march that at least had 1 million people, maybe more. Share with us some of the atmosphere and what you felt was going on there.
Well, I'm first going to say something which is addressing neither of these questions, which is that you've put up there, this debate is about deal or no deal. the march was about no Brexit. And so there is a third option, which is reversing the result of the referendum, either by revoking Article 50, which we can do unilaterally, or by having a second referendum, or both. And that's what the march was about. That's what more than 1 million people were calling for, and probably, as you've seen in the newspapers, in the last 3 days, it may have reached 5 million by now. 4.5 million people, which is the largest ever in the history of parliamentary petitions, have signed a petition calling on Parliament to revoke Article 50. So there is a very strong Remain feeling in the country, and something that was very weird for all of us was that we saw Theresa May on television on Wednesday saying, we will let down the people if we don't go through with Brexit, and you think, who on earth are the people? You know, certainly I'm not one of them, and nor were the 1 million people. Actually, the police estimated 2 million who were on the march yesterday. So Ivan asked me about the march. What I would say is I was on a bit of the march, which was called the Left Bloc. And we had a rally at the beginning. And the aim, and it was absolutely wonderful. There was such a fantastic atmosphere. There were people from all over Britain. People from Bristol, which is the highest, has come top of the petition signing, actually rented an entire train to bring people. But, you know, I was on the podium looking out over the sea of faces. There was Scotland, there was Wales, there was Leeds, there was Yorkshire, there was Hastings. Hastings had a nice poster which said, Hastings loves Europe since 1066. And the aim of the Left Bloc was basically to say the problem with the Remain campaign, and this is partly how I'm coming back to Tom, was that it was defending the status quo. And people were very unhappy with the status quo. We've had 10 years of austerity. We've had 40 years of neoliberal policies, which has left deep inequalities in our societies. And there's huge parts of the country where mining has disappeared, manufacturing has disappeared, where people feel incredibly frustrated, and what they're most frustrated about is politically. They feel all of the attention is focused on the city and on London, and nobody cares about the north of England and the left-behind areas. And so what people were voting for was against the status quo. And what we wanted to do at the Left Bloc was to send a message that Remain doesn't mean the status quo. Actually, those people who voted to leave will be worse off under Brexit. Remain means staying in Europe to try to reform Europe and to try to get things like a Green New Deal. I think one of the most interesting and exciting bits was that we had a very large number of black and Muslim members of parliament and local councillors. We had Labour Party and the Green Party and Scottish nationalists and Welsh nationalists. And you know, they said very explicitly, for them, Brexit is all about the victory of racism, anti-immigration, deregulation, all the things that are going to be particularly bad for black and minority groups. There was a lovely feeling. There were lots of brilliant slogans. I can't resist, what did I do with it? Reading you one, which was almost my favourite, because I think it expresses all that. It said, rest in peace, common sense, community, sanity, tolerance, truth, and cheap wine. And then just finally, to answer Tom, I think it's rubbish that the referendum, everybody wanted the referendum. In fact, Ed Miliband, who was then leader of the Labour Party, was explicitly against holding.
It was his manifesto.
It wasn't.
Yes, it was.
But he was explicit. I remember him saying he was explicitly against it.
Only when it came to the vote. It was in his manifesto.
Before that. I went to a meeting before that.
I think to be fair, his manifesto
anyway.
was a referendum on in specific circumstances. It was a referendum on a further treaty change. It wasn't actually an in-out referendum on membership. It was just that any further treaty change would go to referendum.
He was very explicitly against it. I heard him in meetings a number of times. So first of all, I don't think it was inevitable. Secondly, while I, like Tom, was very worried about the result, I can't say that I was sure it would be leave, but I remember going on the radio the day of the result, and like Tom, I knocked on doors. So I did feel very nervous. I thought it was going to be very close, and I really didn't know which way it would go. And I remember going on the radio, and everyone else was very confident that Remain would win. And I said, I just don't want to say, because I feel it would be tempting fate. And I think it's nonsense to say the Remain campaign was good. It was a disaster. I completely agree with you, by the way, that Corbyn did not campaign. But I also would like to tell you that the left was sidelined by the Remain campaign. I mean, I don't think it was only his fault. I wrote how many times I want to help with this campaign, and I never even got a reply. So maybe I'm not a very good campaigner or something, but I'm just giving you this as an example.
One of the principal organiser was Will Straw, who...
Yeah, and it was Will Straw, because he's a Blairite. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, this is within the Labour Party.
Yeah, this is Labour Party factional politics.
Well, no, but I think the Labour Party saw it as a centrist campaign, and actually what it needed was a strong push against the status quo on the need to reform Europe and all of those issues. And that's what came out very, very strongly yesterday at the Left Bloc rally.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. Tessa, you're an Austrian in London, not an Englishman in New York.
Yeah.
You've written the book, you were there during the events. Can you comment on this issue? How did you see this whole issue of bringing up the referendum? Was it purely a party thing to keep the Conservative Party together? As Tom said, there were obviously requests prior in other parties.
I think it's too easy maybe to say that it was purely a party thing, which is now sort of the common narrative that David Cameron put this on in an easy way because he thought he's the winner. In any case, he will settle this question for a generation and move on. So in that sense, it was an inner Tory party game, which now brings down the entire House and the country and the European Union membership with it. But there is another thing behind this, of course, too, and there is this specific British way of looking at Europe and of its role inside the European Union. And we have discussed this now back and forth many times already. And I think the Maastricht Treaty moment when, especially in England, people started to think this political project that is appearing here, we did not sign up for. That doesn't mean that everyone was super against it. You know, Margaret Thatcher still built the single market, and Tony Blair was at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, probably the most pro-European prime minister the European Union ever had, in a sense. You know, there was especially in Britain then the sense that we should enlarge the European Union, bring in Eastern European, Southern European countries, which he did maybe in order to prevent a tighter political integration. But it was one version of a European model which was a promising one for Britain then too. So on the one hand, you had a very special Eurosceptic situation in Britain always, but it didn't mean that this was necessarily leading to the exit or to Brexit as we have it now. And I think this was really, to come back to David Cameron, his easy-handed idea that he would be able to settle that. And he didn't understand that one thing that, as you mentioned, Tom, that we have populist waves everywhere now and right populist nationalist forces coming up in this country as it did in Britain. But Britain was not used to populism, and that's one of the problems with the referendum. Britain was not prepared to handle a referendum because people were not used in their parliamentary system to give voice to anyone else than the two big winners that are sitting comfortably in parliament. And this is what fed into this whole chaos that we see now. It's an utter irresponsible way of handing something to the population, to the people, which was not discussed before, which had no consensus afterwards, and just rushing in to negotiations with the European Union, which now is looking at Britain as if, you know, you expect a putsch in the political system every day because the Prime Minister lost control of her government, of her parliament. The people are on the street. You know, in a way, the populist wave is hitting back now at the political leadership in Britain because it's now 1 million or 2 on the streets of London. We have never had such a pro-European public in Britain as we have it now at the moment. To not use this in the next weeks, months and years would be really a shame, in my opinion.
Just a follow-up question. Listening, as I said, to BBC this morning, they had a Conservative MP whose name I didn't retain, but he was asked the question to react to the march yesterday in London, and the journalist asked, you know, how does that impinge on the decision? And he gave a kind of, I would say, very political, theoretical answer. Political decisions are made in Parliament. That's why we have a democracy and representative democracy. The march against the Iraq War under Tony Blair of 1 million did not change Tony Blair's mind. I don't think this will change anything. Will Hutton tweeted later on that brought down Tony Blair and his image. This will change Corbyn's stature because he wasn't there. How do you see this? Do you think that the march can have an effect?
Well, I'm afraid that it won't, because the political leadership, although it's failing, is not giving up its power. So we'll see now in the next weeks in Parliament what will happen. And Britain is so proud of its representative democracy and that Parliament is deciding things and not handing it over all the time to the population. But since it has handed it 3 years ago to the population to decide, and the Parliament and government could not deliver on the results, I think it would be utterly democratic to ask the people again. I know that Tom totally disagrees on this point, and Dennis probably too, because it's sort of the official way of looking at this problem now is that Britain has already left. The question is, can you do it without political chaos or with political chaos?
Tessa, the question you raise, and it's the legitimate one, is how does a parliamentary system, an indirect democracy, work with direct democracy? And that is, as you correctly identify, the challenge. But I fail to see that solution to the challenge between indirect democracy and direct democracy is to do more of both. I think you've got to choose. And the choice you've got to make is either, right, we accept that direct democracy is the way we're going to go forward, and therefore we're going to diminish the power of Parliament, we're going to increase the role of referenda, or, and I would suggest this is the better answer, you say, look, we've had 4 referendums in the UK, 3 of them agreed with Parliament, and so they were easy. 1 of them didn't, which demonstrates the inability of an indirect democracy to deal with direct mandates, which is why countries like Germany and the United States do not allow direct democracy, because it creates a political challenge that is, bluntly, not resolvable.
But once you've created it, you can't just say, go away.
No.
It's so profoundly undemocratic to say people aren't allowed to change their minds. Actually, Theresa May thinks she can bring back her deal to Parliament 3 times just to get the right answer. But somehow it's completely unacceptable. And the way in which people say the people have spoken, well, the people were lied to, there was populism, there was all of these things. Nobody really knew what they were voting for. There was no proper discussion, no proper deliberation about it. And now we say it's set in stone. And I just think you can't suddenly say we're against direct democracy. I tend to agree with you. I mean, I'm a great believer in deliberative democracy. But once you've allowed these forces to say it's undemocratic to do it again is profoundly problematic.
First of all, I didn't say it was undemocratic. There are many different ways of doing democracy. But if what you want to do is to set up two democratic systems that are inherently challenging each other, then that's what you do. And then you end up with stasis.
Mary,
but I do think that, you know, and maybe Denis can talk about it, I think the Irish have shown the way of how to do referendums, which is to combine them with a deliberative process. And I understand that the Irish actually offered to David Cameron to help him do this in a more deliberative way. And I think if we had, it would have produced a different result, but maybe Denis will.
Well, the Irish now, we have a lot of referendums in Ireland. Really the only way to change our constitution is through referendums. And in recent years, we've developed the system of citizens' assemblies, which are randomly chosen citizens, and they meet over a period of months, and they discuss various options. And what has happened is, for example, you saw it in the most recent referendum on abortion. What happened was that the Citizens' Assembly came up with a proposal which was much more radical than the politicians probably would have on their own. And it then went to Parliament, and through a system of parliamentary committees, that then emerged as being the proposal for that went to referendum, which then was accepted with an overwhelming majority. But the point was that a lot of the difficulties of information, of what's true, what's not true, what are the real facts about this stuff, you actually get a period of a year or so where this is filtering upwards, so that the public becomes a bit better informed. And also the people who are actually campaigning, the politicians, they also know perhaps a little bit more than they might if they were just running into a kind of a quick 3-week campaign. So I do think that it's, you know, as a way of doing referendums, if you want to do them, then I think it probably is quite a useful way. I think, though, where the second referendum is concerned in Britain, I don't have a problem with the idea of having a second referendum, but obviously it has to be, you have to get Parliament to approve a second referendum, and I'm not sure that there's really much sign of a majority in Parliament to do that right now. I have another problem, though, or I think at least the second referendum campaign is another problem, which is that they find it very hard to make a case for membership of the European Union. In that Will Hutton, who you mentioned, who was tweeting out of this march yesterday, Will Hutton was on the radio recently saying, well, of course, you know, if we go back in, if we decide to stay, they'll give us a special deal on free movement of people, so we won't have to have it. And you had Tony Blair saying, all the rest of the Europeans, they want to change the rules on free movement. For most of us Europeans, free movement is one of the best things about being in the European Union. It's one of the things that directly affects your life. And so if you ask these people who are running this campaign, the second referendum, are you going to campaign to join the euro? Are you going to campaign to be part of Schengen? Are you going to campaign to be at the center of building this European future? And the answer, of course, is absolutely not. Now, some of them would like to build it. Some people like Mary are interested in having a pan-European reform movement, which is something I would support, and there's an awful lot to be reformed in the European Union. But I do think that if you look back at the origin of where we are now, the decision not to join the euro was the moment when it became clear that mainstream British politics was checking out of the central political project of the European Union. And from that moment on, it really was a question of exactly where within this system it was going to be. But it was never going to be at the heart of it, and maybe you could have had some kind of, variable geometry or all of these other things that we speak about over the years. But the fact is that then once it came to the referendum, they had it, and now here we are dealing with the consequences.
Our colleague whom I mentioned, Helen Wallace, who is one of the most eminent connoisseurs of the European Union in Great Britain, when she gave her inaugural lecture at Sussex, it was entitled "From an Island Off the Northwest Coast of Europe," which I think said a lot about the atmospherics and the zeitgeist of the British. You are from Ireland, Denis. How does this whole thing look to you and to public opinion and to the political elite? Obviously, we'll get to the backstop and all of those thorny questions, but
yes.
A sort of a general impression, you know, how are you living this in Ireland?
Well, Ireland has famously been described as an island behind an island, which in a way it is. But for the Irish, what they saw once the referendum was called, first of all, it's clear that it's allowed in the European treaties to leave the European Union, so it's a legitimate decision. But it was clear to the Irish that it was going to present problems for us. And the problem specifically was to do with the border. And it wasn't really just the border. It was to do with the whole of the Good Friday Agreement, because what the Good Friday Agreement produced was a system of power sharing in Northern Ireland, so that the two communities had to be represented in the government. But it also then it placed Northern Ireland in a unique constitutional position, so that Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom. But it wasn't part of the United Kingdom in exactly the same way as Scotland or Wales is, because, first of all, another country, the Irish Republic, has a consultative role. Secondly, people in Northern Ireland can choose to be Irish or British or both. And so what Brexit creates a problem for is actually that Irish dimension. Because one of the reasons that peace has flourished in Northern Ireland since the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago is because people whose aspiration was to be Irish and to be part of a united Ireland, they found that in practical terms, they didn't need to fulfill that by actually being part of a unitary Irish state, because they were able to carry an Irish passport, do all their business in the same way, go over and back across the border. If you live near the border, you can access healthcare on one side of the border or another. It makes no difference. You go to whichever hospital is nearer to you. And so the European Union was the background for all of this, and it was an invisible part of what kept the whole system together. And what Brexit does, potentially, is that you have to, the external border of the European Union is the Irish border. And if the United Kingdom is outside the customs union and outside the single market, then you have to have some way of checking what goods are coming into the European single market through the Irish border. So are these up to the right European standards? Are animal welfare, are the animals healthy? Is the meat safe to eat? And also then you have to check for tariffs, and you have to do all of this stuff. So it's partly a technical question of how you do this, but it's much more than that. And so the reason why this rather complicated solution called the backstop, this insurance policy, came up was because it isn't just about checks. So what the backstop basically said was that for this border to remain open and for life to continue as normal, really Northern Ireland has to remain within an awful lot of the European Union rules. It has to remain in the European Union Customs Union, and it has to follow most of the rules of the European single market. And then the question is, how do you do that without creating a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom? And the answer the British government came up with was, we'll all get into a kind of customs union. And anyway, this obviously is presenting a problem for parts of the Conservative Party, and it's one of the problems that Theresa May is facing in getting her deal through. But for Ireland, this a legitimate decision by our closest neighbour created this huge problem for us. And so the reason that the Irish have been so single-minded in insisting that they would actually risk all the damage that a no-deal Brexit would cause to Ireland, which would be enormous, is because they felt that it was an existential national interest that you keep the peace, that you keep the border open. And the calculation, frankly, is that a no-deal Brexit is probably not an end state. If Britain leaves without a deal suddenly, that will probably not remain the end of the story, that at some stage there will be some negotiation about a future relationship. And so that whatever arrangements happen by virtue of a no-deal Brexit will be temporary, and that then the permanent arrangement, whatever it happens to be, must be one that protects the Good Friday Agreement.
I'd like to go to a broader issue that's not relevant only for the UK, but for other European countries, where there has been, to put it very colloquially, Brussels bashing over the decades. It's very convenient for governments to say, oh, it's the fault of Brussels and it's not us. So I'd like to do a round on that from your various vantage points. Tom, starting with you, and I remember a friend of Boris Johnson saying that when he was correspondent in Brussels for the Daily Telegraph about 20 odd so years ago, Johnson said to him, look, if I don't write an article that's sort of critical and negative about Brussels, it won't be published in the Telegraph. So there's been sort of systematic building up or negativity of Euroscepticism, which is completely legitimate, and I think all of us by now are Euro-critical in many dimensions, and the need for reform of the European Union is obvious. But how much do you think this kind of building up of a more generalized view that, you know, in the extreme words of Viktor Orban, you know, Brussels is the new Moscow, how much that played into the lead up to the referendum and then into the result, knowing full well that it was always going to be a national decision about, as Mary was saying, domestic issues as well?
Look, I mean, I think the truth is the referendum started in 1995 with the Maastricht Accord. I mean, ever since then, British politicians, with only the exception of Tony Blair, have not defended the European Union in any meaningful fashion. Some have been directly hostile to it. People like Bill Cash, Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, Bernard Jenkin have been campaigning to leave for 30 years or more than 30 years. But nobody has been defending it seriously. And then, you know, Tony Blair's decision, which wasn't followed everywhere when the new accession states joined, to not have the transition period of free movement, meant that there was a sudden population change in the UK which was greater than was expected. And so yes, it is certainly true that the British media environment is, how can I put it, a rough world, and and I'm sure Mary and others have been on the receiving end of it at various points. But it's also true to say that those who claimed to be committed to cooperating with Europe did absolutely nothing to try and make the case back. It's very noticeable that, and you know, Denis put it very well, even today, pro-European politicians very rarely defend the European Union. They defend the single market, or they defend, you know, the economic element. I can't think, actually I can think of one British politician who makes the case that the European project is a peace project that has economic benefits, but only one.
Hazeltine. Mary, how has it been over these two decades to speak about Europe and
I do
show its
agree
benefits?
that Europe bashing in the tabloid press and the right-wing press.
And the Morning Star.
That much in the Morning Star? I'm not sure, actually. I wouldn't say so, and I love the way you're trying to
I'm just pointing out that it's
I love the way
general.
You're trying to dub the Labour Party as the party that's anti-Europe. The polls show that 90% of Labour members are...
It's not the Labour Party, it's Corbyn who's anti-Europe.
Okay, but, you know, you said the Morning Star, which is actually the communists. And I think it's even not Corbyn. I actually think it's his chief of communications and Len McCluskey of Unite. I think there are 2 or 3 people who are... I think actually Corbyn has said very clearly many a time that he voted Remain and he would still vote Remain. And if you look at some of his speeches, he was quite passionate about joining with other socialists across Europe to reform Europe. And MacDonald the same. I've heard him speak in quite passionate ways. We can go into a long discussion of the Labour Party, but I just think Brexit is a Tory project. That's what I think. Now, whether the Tory... I think there are 2 things to say. One is, yes, the Europe bashing in the right-wing press. And what is extraordinary is that lots of the things that were bashed were things that Britain itself was pushing for. And that Britain, more than any other country, has been responsible for the neoliberal turn of the European Union. So that's a sort of paradox. I think also Europe bashing is a bashing not only against Europe but against immigration. It's a code for racism. So I think all of that has to be said. But I also think, and this really has to be stressed, that there are profound socioeconomic factors that led to the no vote. There's profound unhappiness and dissatisfaction in our society. And I would mention two groups. I mean, I mentioned before the left behind, the people who were proud industrial workers, and so on and so forth, and the fact that now Britain's wealth comes almost entirely from the city and no longer from manufacturing. But I also think we should not underestimate imperial nostalgia. An awful lot of the people who voted for Brexit, and I know many of them, are middle-class people whose ancestors were out in the empire, living in grand houses, having lots of servants, and who feel they're owed some privileged position. And it's that frustration, which I think Fintan O'Toole has captured wonderfully as English nationalism. It's also a feeling we went out, we won the Second World War, and what did we get for it? We just lost the empire.
I wonder, though, Mary, I mean, I think there is an element of nostalgia, but I always think that the nostalgia is actually for the post-war settlement. The nostalgia is actually for the 1960s. It's for the Britain of British Rail, British Leyland, British Steel, the National Health Service. It's actually, and in a sense, in a funny way, the decision to join the European Union was a last attempt to maintain a foothold of greatness in the world. And in a sense, what Brexit is doing is retreating into middle-sized power status. It is actually saying, you know, I mean, if you talk to people, to Brexiteers, about what, you know, where Britain will be in between all these blocks in the world, you know, China, America, Europe, they talk about moving niftily between them. Now, that's how small countries like Austria and Ireland operate. We shift in and out. And that's, you know, it's not the way a big great imperial power thinks. So I think it may be almost the opposite of what you think.
No, Denis, I agree with what you've said, but I think the nostalgia you're talking about is coming from the left behind. I think there's another element. You know, there was a huge rural vote. It's the rural areas that voted leave overwhelmingly. There's another element of people who feel they are owed a privileged future and have not got it.
I have to support Mary on this one, because if you go to the pubs in Middle England and you sit with people who have jobs, I mean, they're not unemployed, they're just unhappy that they're not sure if the children will have the jobs and what will happen with all this, you know, glitzy capital that you can't visit because you can't afford the theater tickets and the restaurant prices and all this. And you speak to them, and then they say, and it happened to me many times, they say, we are a small island and we ruled the world once, we'll just do it again. And you sit there, you think like, okay, so the empire is gone. India is not waiting to make another empire 2.0 with you guys. Now you're leaving the European Union, which is the natural habitat, which didn't exist in the 60s as a strong single market, an obvious place to be if you are at, you know, the border of Europe on an island. You want to be, of course, a member of this single market, and even if at the cost of some political engagement, because if you speak to anyone who is in a similar situation like Britain will be now soon, like Norway, the Norwegian Prime Minister will be the first one to say, like, do not take a deal where you are a member of the single market, but you don't have a say in Brussels. I mean, this is where the Tory party is heading now in full swing, aided, unfortunately, by Corbyn's Labour Party. But the interesting thing, because you asked about the media, if you look at the British media today, the Tory party has been is at the far right end and not represented in its own media anymore, because the Economist, the Financial Times, the Times, they are very pro-European and not following this trend to the far right that has taken over the Tory party internal debate. You have the big boulevard papers that have been viciously anti-European, The Sun. But the second biggest daily, the Daily Mail, got a new editor because the owners of the Daily Mail finally thought that this is just a crazy path they're on. So they replaced the editor-in-chief, and the Daily Mail is not so sure anymore what to say and what to support, has really lowered the hostility towards Europe. I mean, I have the feeling that it is time maybe to move away from the media bashing debate, because it's reflecting only the political debate, as it is in our countries also, you know. And in the British, this is really the moment where things are changing. And if you would be a mediator in a divorce fight, you would say, like, okay, take a pause, have a coffee, come back in a while and have a think. Like you said with the Citizen Assembly in Ireland, that would be the right way to deal with this problem, because now this Brexit chaos as we see it, and Tom would say it's just a stiff upper lip that is trembling a little. But in fact, we are waiting at the moment for a political putsch. When we get out of this hall, Theresa May might have been disposed already by your party colleagues, and on a WhatsApp group, by the way, because that's how Parliament in Britain is now run. It's not really run anymore by whips. It's not a party line that is being given. It's not Downing Street that is running it. This is sort of, you know, a profound political crisis that needs time to be resolved and not rushed into a Brexit that maybe the country doesn't want anymore.
Absolutely, I agree.
Austrian public.
I'm sorry, guys, but you're an Austrian audience from Vienna. You know? I didn't think you were Brexiteers, okay?
Yeah, we could take a vote afterwards.
Yeah, I'm not sure it'd be entirely representative.
No, certainly not. Rob Watson, the chief political correspondent of the BBC this morning, asked, you know, how do you see it, Rob? He said, well, the profound political crisis is becoming profounder as we move forward. Let me just switch gears for a second, because I think this is important, given not only where we are, but more generally. What is the effect on the European Union of whatever might happen and of what has already happened? We have all seen that following Brexit, but also following, and it's important to note, the victory of Donald Trump in the US, there has been a resurgence for the support of Europe. And my simple explanation is Europeans, with their common sense, which everyone has, have put their finger to their head and said, my goodness, what would it be if this thing started to unravel and we pulled the thread of an exit of Britain earlier with Greece, you know, that we go back to the dark times. And I, as some of you know, who come from the former Yugoslavia, has lived the worst of the dark times in Europe at the end of the 20th century with the breakdown and war in a country. So, Tessa, let me ask you first, how do you think this impinges on the European Union?
Well, if you think how it started 3 years ago, the European Union waking up on the 24th of June thinking, what happened? What are we doing now? You know, it was such a humiliation for the European project if the second biggest member state voluntarily leaves. The second biggest economy will be lost to the European Union. The biggest military power, maybe almost on the same level like France now, but sort of the ones that can actually lead wars and make the European voice heard also in the battlefield, leaving, turning back to the European Union. It was a terrible, terrible moment, I think. And that in the middle of the refugee crisis that completely overwhelmed all the capitals in any case. And strangely now, 3 years later, due also to the weakness of the British negotiators and the uncertainty of what they actually wanted. But the European Union has presented itself as a rather united club of reasonable people. I mean, you know, they were criticized for insisting on these 3 points that are now part of the withdrawal treaty. But one of them, for example, the Northern Ireland guarantee for the Good Friday Agreement, is one of the things which I think will come to haunt the Tory party later, that people were willing to throw the Northern Ireland piece under the red bus of Boris Johnson was just such an irresponsible thing to do. So I think the European Union presented itself as the voice of reason and rationality. Also the fact, of course, that they insisted that the EU citizens' rights will be protected after Britain leaves. You would have thought that's a totally normal thing that everyone would immediately agree to. I mean, it took like 3 years of being a negotiating chip. I mean, I personally am a negotiating chip, and it's not my personal problem because I can leave. You know, as a journalist, you're not so rooted. But many, many families in Britain who are from France or Austria or Sweden or something, they don't know 5 days before this official Brexit date, the 29th of March, which is now postponed 3 weeks, if actually their rights will really be guaranteed. But you don't know who comes to power in Britain. You don't know if you have no deal and then all bets are off. At the moment, there's no real preparation.
I mean, I take your point, but I think you're pushing it beyond the point of reason. And that, you know, it is true that the negotiation over citizens' rights was held in a particularly uncomfortable way. I agree with you. But today, settled status has been agreed by Parliament and the government to all European Union citizens. You can apply for it immediately and you have rights going on for the end of your life. If you're a Brit in France, you have no rights. If you're a Brit in Spain, you have the right to vote, but it's not clear that you have the right to use the health service. You know, there's a whole series of things where you're quite right, you say this, the European Union was willing to talk about it, but member states haven't. And when you look at, you know, when you look at citizens' rights, you've got to look at, and changes in the government, you're absolutely right. There are potential changes within the UK government, and that's certainly true. But to many people in the UK, you know, there are plenty of people in my own party who I wouldn't like to see as Prime Minister, and that's not much of a secret. But there aren't any Nazis in government. And in Austria today, there is an actual Nazi party that has done a deal with the ruling party. That is, I mean, to a Brit, this is just truly extraordinary. That a party that wears the cornflower, that sings the songs, that was founded by an SS officer, is like a legitimate political party?
Theresa May was responsible for the hostile environment. Theresa May was responsible for the hostile environment for immigrants and the terrible things that have happened to immigrants, including detention, deportation.
Look, I mean, there are many of us who've written against the deportation.
I know, but you know,
policy.
we have
and
a
you know,
situation.
the hostile environment was started by Alan Johnson and the last Labour administration. I mean, the truth is that the British government, for the last 15 years, has been an extremely hostile environment for migration. That has been true of Labour governments.
And we've had a terrifying rise in hate crime since the Brexit vote. I mean, to me, it is really alarming what Brexit means for
there is no
tolerance
fascist party in government in the UK. Not a single one.
Well, I think
the AFD,
I think
frankly, your
party has elements which I would call very close to fascism.
The Conservative Party? I don't think that. I really don't. I think these distinctions are important, and I actually don't think that's true. Certainly in terms of elected representatives, I really don't think that is true. Whereas there are European countries, including this one, where you do have elected representatives who could be described fairly. As
people like me will not meet members of the Austrian Parliament because of that.
Yeah. I think just to go back for a second to the business, to the impact on the rest of Europe of Brexit, Tessa is absolutely right that the negotiations have shown, in a way, the best of Europe in that it was not only united, but also it conducted the negotiations with a ruthless rationalism. And, for example, after the summit on Thursday night and Friday morning, I met one of the senior EU officials, and he was describing what had happened. And of course, you know, when Theresa May went in a way, the only thing she had was the threat to leave without a deal next Friday. Obviously, it would have been terrible for Britain, but it would have been bad for everybody else. And the Europeans would have had to come back on Thursday night and make this decision to throw Britain out 24 hours later. And so this guy said, you know, all they had was the date. Now we've taken that away from them. And so the European Union now is controlling the timetable. It's controlling the parliamentary timetable for Brexit for the next few weeks. And there's very, very little that the UK can do about that. I think frankly, from the European point of view, the best possible outcome is to have an orderly exit agreed over the next few weeks, for Britain to remain closely integrated economically and closely integrated in terms of security and defence. And this is something, and also in terms of foreign policy. If you look, one of the interesting things that has happened over the last year or so is that on all of these issues that have divided Europe from the United States, like Iran, for example, and others, the United Kingdom has fallen very firmly into the European camp. And so there's no question but that for both parties, Britain can be useful to Europe and Europe can be useful to Britain in terms of the economy and in terms of defence and security. I'm not sure that Britain can be useful to Europe as an element in the political discussion within Europe about Europe's political future, because I just don't think that Britain wants that. And I think it would be best to divorce politically and remain integrated as much as possible on those other matters.
Who is Britain? Who is Britain? I mean, I think actually British people, British civil servants in the European Commission, British commissioners have played quite, I don't want to defend us because I think we've also played a very negative role, but I think to say Britain would be bad for Europe, which is basically what you're saying, is a huge exaggeration, especially as there's been an enormous pro-European engagement and shift of opinion going on in Britain. So going back to Ivan's question, I think there is a lot in it that the Brexit vote has sort of propelled a new concern about the future of Europe, which is, I think, very healthy. But what I think is underestimated is that I do think, and I will say it again, that Brexit is a far-right project. I think it's not going to be a nice, smooth exit, whatever way we go. I think we actually, as many people have been saying, this is just the withdrawal agreement. We haven't decided on the future political relationships. We're going to have 10, if we go under May's deal or even a soft deal, we're going to have 10 years of arguing and fighting about this, that the European Union will be involved in too. 10 more years of this horrendous debate is really terrifying. Not only that, but I think if Brexit goes through, it will be a big empowerment to the right, a political empowerment to the right. And, you know, that is what really frightens me.
The problem with the argument...
basically what we've been doing with the Brexit discussion is appeasing rather than engaging in discussion. You know, I've heard, and it includes Labour MPs, so if you want to do a bit of Labour bashing, I'm happy with that. They say we have to respect what people think. But I think respecting what people think is engaging with them in argument and debate. And that's what we haven't done. And I think what respect means is appeasement. And I think that's a huge worry for the future.
Tom?
I barely know where to start. Look, the reality is we've spoken about very little else for the best part of 20 years in British politics. We've spoken about Europe obsessively. And the truth is, yes, our relationship with Europe over the next, whatever it is, 5-10 years is going to dominate a lot of political thinking. And guess what? Our relationship with Europe has dominated a lot of political thinking in England for the best part of 2,500 years. And sometimes it's gone well, and we've had very good and friendly relationships. And 200 years of Viking raids weren't that great. There's been upsides, there's downsides, and this is just the nature of living together as nation states. I mean, we have to engage in foreign policy. We have permanent foreign secretaries for the exact reason that actually foreign policy is a daily business. Getting on with your neighbours is just a daily business. And it's true that for the last 40-odd years it's become a civil service sport that has been able to be done in Brussels quietly because it was sort of subcontracted out. But the truth is that a lot of people don't feel very comfortable with that, not just in the United Kingdom. You can go to Poland, go to Hungary, go to Italy, go to France, go to Spain, go to Greece, and you will find many, many people who are equally as uncomfortable with that. And at various points you have to ask, how do you address legitimate objections? And I wanted us to remain. I lost the vote. And the trouble is, the democracy, sometimes you lose. Now,
and then sometimes you win, and you're allowed to change your mind. Yeah. We've had 2 elections in the last year.
Yes, and the truth is, if you look at the polling, if you look at any of them, the numbers haven't really shifted.
They have shifted.
That's not
Apart
true,
from anything else,
That's
a large number of the old people who voted against have died, and a large number of the young people who want to stay in Europe have reached voting age.
First of all, this is a rather sick. This is a rather sick political theory that what you've got to do is you've got to kill people in order to change the electoral maps.
She didn't say that you have to kill them.
I just said they died.
Yeah.
They're old, and this is about the future.
Well,
including me, I'm old too.
So people over a certain age shouldn't be allowed to vote? I mean, look.
No, I think so, but Mary, I'm just saying young people should be allowed to vote about their future.
Mary, first of all, the demographics. Secondly, the demographics simply don't bear that out. The Leave vote was people between the ages of 45 and 75. Once you got over the age of 70, you're more likely to vote Remain. So actually, the difference in voting numbers is not nearly as direct as you suggest.
But the polls do show there have been, over the last few months, there's been a distinct and consistent...
Sorry, that is simply not true.
It is true. We can show you the polls.
The polls on this, and also on the generational issue. How do you see it from your?
Well, the generational issue shows that there are 2 million young voters now that could not vote because they were underage in 2016 who could vote now. And of these 2 million, I think I'm not the only one who would think that the majority would vote to Remain. So there is a shift in the generational thing. That it was always clear that the fear people are more in the older section of the society and all this. So I would try it, Tom, if I would be you, because as a former Remainer, there might have been a chance. But can I just say one thing about the European debate? And I understand that Denis, in particular, is super sick of Brexit and reporting on Brexit day in and day out, because the Irish Times, of course, this is the main issue always, even at midnight. And also in Brussels, people are sick of Brexit and want it to be done, and in Britain, people are sick of Brexit and want it to be done. But I think the beauty of the European project was that we have these different opinions within one society, but also within the European Union. We have huge problems with political forces in Hungary and Poland and also in Austria. And this is just, you are just part of the parcel in Britain that has a split public opinion on the question if you want free movement of people. I would have been so happy if Britain would still take this seat on the table and discuss it. We don't know how the European Union will look like in 10 years, and I would really hope that free movement of people will stay for all of us, because it is so beneficial, especially for young people who set out and go for their lives. But I think it's the really lamest and weakest way to take off and sail off alone into an unknown future, which doesn't look so rosy anyway, and give up this seat at the table, because Britain would have been, as a Eurosceptic member, also welcomed by some other Eurosceptic members. I think we should be able to take this challenge as Europeans and as members of the European Union and face this and discuss how the future will look like.
And if I can just...
If I can just add to that, it reminds me of a recent statement of the foreign minister of Northern Macedonia, Nikola Dimitrov, who was asked, but why do you want to join this European Union when it's, crumbling? He says, that's because you don't know how it feels to be outside.
What I just wanted to add, that a survey done at my university at London School of Economics immediately after the referendum of young people found that 47% of the people they surveyed said they had actually cried the morning after the referendum. And freedom of movement is so important for the young generation. It's not just, being able to, Euro train or whatever it is. It's not just being able to go on holiday and all of those things, but it's also, Erasmus has been hugely important. And for young people to have all those opportunities blocked off for them in the future is really a tragedy.
No, and I think it's also true, it's certainly true that the intensity of feeling on the Remain side is much stronger and much deeper than generally the media reflects. I think that is something where we in the media have failed to reflect it, because the easier story was to talk about the left behind, and as you say, also not to talk about well-off rural Brexit voters. So there was a caricature of Brexit as being this insurgency by this kind of proto-Gilets jaunes movement, whereas of course it was a coalition of oldish conservative poor people and oldish conservative fairly well-off people. But likewise, this feeling, it is intense on the side. But I just do think that now that the step has been taken, I just think that even if you had a referendum, and unless you were to have a referendum which was a resounding vote in favour of full integration in the European Union in all its forms, then I do think you'd be sort of limping back in as a slightly sulky, awkward member. And you've been awkward long enough, really, you know.
Well, awkward since the beginning.
Yeah.
Let me address a question that I think is important, and that's on the minds of many people. If this all goes ahead and there is an exit, what happens to the Union, to the United Kingdom? Does it stay together, or is there a beginning of a process, as some have alluded to, Scotland principally, that there would be a beginning of an exit?
I think certainly Brexit has strained the bonds of the Union, certainly with Scotland, but more particularly in Ireland. I'll speak about Ireland. One of the reasons why you have a majority in favour of remaining part of the United Kingdom is because of the acquiescence of a lot of the Catholic or nationalist community. For the reasons I described earlier, it doesn't really matter in the current circumstances whether it's a United Ireland or you're not part of the United Kingdom. You can live your life kind of either way. If you were to have the kind of Brexit which would create a real border between the two parts of Ireland, then I think that support for the Union would evaporate, and that then you do have a demographic issue where within a few years you probably would have a majority for a United Ireland. And under the Belfast Agreement, if that majority is evident, then you have to have a poll, a referendum, and if you have a referendum in both parts of Ireland and both parts of Ireland vote to unite, that's what's got to happen. And I do think that Brexit and the policy actually of the main Unionist Party, the Democratic Unionist Party, that they've pursued has actually, it is operating against the interests of Unionists, and it is weakening the position of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom.
Tessa, what's
Shall
your
I
feeling?
do the Scotland bit then,
Yeah.
although I'm not Scottish at all.
No.
But the political leadership of Scotland has not changed its position that it will ask for secession, for independence once the Brexit process has settled. The chances for that are maybe not as big as they once were, because the political leadership is in not such good shape. Also, the finances are not in good shape. Scotland is relatively poor. It's also not for sure that the European Union would welcome Scotland so easily. So I wouldn't think that the disintegration of the United Kingdom starts fast and furiously with Scotland. I think what the danger comes at the moment for the United Kingdom and the internal structures and doings comes actually from England, where this Brexit vote is really the emergence of this English nationalist movement, which will be very hard to control once Brexit happens. Also, if Brexit should not happen, because it's out there now on the streets, and people have become very bitter. The English have become bitter about their own union because they feel the Scottish get the extra things. They have their own devolved parliament. The Northern Irish have the same special assemblies. Wales has the same thing. The only ones who have not got their own parliament is the English, because it's the Parliament in Westminster, the House of Commons, is actually the British Parliament, not the English Parliament, although some people might want to see it as the English Parliament. But so this will go on, and I think there will be a lot of tension coming from this corner. And it's also worth a debate, because England should have its own parliament, and then certain issues could be also decided on a local level and not necessarily on the British level.
Mary, I'll ask you the same question, but I cannot resist reading a sentence from Orwell, who says, George Orwell, "The insularity of the English, their refusal to take foreigners seriously, is a folly that has to be paid for very heavily from time to time."
Well, I always agree with Orwell. But I suppose what I think is, I think the problem with English nationalism is that it's so bound up with British nationalism. I think that's the problem. I don't think having a separate English parliament is going to solve the problem of English nationalism. And that's why I think we could have a lot of tension and disintegration. I think, I mean, obviously if it's a very, very soft Brexit, the economic effects won't be quite so great. But I think we are going to see a lot more, you know, a continuation of inequality, a continuation of this deregulatory approach by government, so a continuation of extreme inequalities. I think Brexit, we haven't talked about, has very much been linked to the fact that, to crony capitalism actually, to the rise of crony capitalism in our society, and that's going to get worse. And so I do imagine a lot of tensions. I'm not so confident that Scotland won't go independent. And actually, while I'd quite like to see a united Ireland, what I'm really afraid of is renewed violence. And so I think all of that is very depressing. I want to say one thing to come back on what Denis said on the referendum. I don't actually agree with you, Denis, and the reason is that I think everybody who looks at this from the outside tends to underestimate the role of grassroots movements. If you look at how well Corbyn did in the 2017 election, I don't think it can be just attributed to Corbyn's charisma. I think there was a real grassroots movement behind him, and equally part of that was a pro-European movement. The grassroots pro-European movement were organising tactical voting, and Corbyn and his team have not recognised how important that was and how well they did. And so what I think is that if there were a referendum campaign, you'd see this grassroots movement all over the country in a very major way. And so I don't think it would be limping home. I think you would see a substantial change. I know Tom's going to disagree with me, but... No.
But I'd just like to hear you on Scotland and the future of the UK.
Well, my view is that Scotland will sooner or later become independent if we leave the European Union. It isn't such a big issue if we're inside the European Union. If we're outside, it is. And not only do I think Scotland, I think if Scotland goes and Ireland goes, probably eventually even Wales might go. I sort of really do think, and it always makes me completely amazed by how cavalier the pro-Brexiteers, who are supposed to be for Britain and its global role, are about the Irish backstop. It's just amazing to me that they think we can be great outside Europe, and they're not even discussing the disintegration of Britain.
Tom?
I think Denis's point on Northern Ireland was, broadly speaking, right. I still think it's unlikely, but it is the most likely of the changes that may happen. You know, the reality is, and we've known this for many years, that the demographics have been going towards the nationalist community and away from the unionist community for, well, generations. That's not news. But it's worth noting that Northern Ireland and the Republic they're very different places. Culturally, they're very different places. Even within the nationalist community, they're very different places. And certainly if you spend time in parts of the nationalist community in a town like Derry, you'd think it would be quite similar to a town like Cavan. Both of them are border towns. They're roughly the same size. They're not. They're culturally very different. You know, in the Republic, there tends to be very large employers or agriculture. In the north, it tends to be much smaller employers, much more entrepreneurial. Look, I see the challenge, and I see the question, and of course the Belfast Accord gives the possibility, but I think it's too early to tell. I think it's way too early to tell. On the question of Scotland, I think Scotland's really interesting. Because actually one thing that Brexit has done is it's persuaded a lot of people in Scotland how difficult divorce is. So, you know, and the complexities of leaving a 45-year economic relationship are one thing. The complexity of leaving a 300-year deeply ingrained political union are a whole different ballgame. And so the independence movement in Scotland has had a reality check from that, and it's also had a reality check from the fact that its principal leaders, people like Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, are, in Alex's case, distracted by Russian money, and in Nicola's case, distracted by internal problems within the Edinburgh government that are not being resolved terribly well.
So I'd like to ask you a question now, and of course we know, all of us know many people from the UK who are seeking passports of European Union members or have already got them, Irish, German, Polish, Austrian probably, you name it. But where I want to go is that, to put it very mildly, there's this paradox that some of the most ardent Brexiteers are people who are in business, let me put it that way. For example, Sir James Dyson, and many of us use his vacuum cleaners, has decided to build a plant in Singapore. Jacob Rees-Mogg has a hedge fund that's moved to Ireland. So while you have this sovereignist move,
that's not entirely fair. Actually, I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think just to be fair to him, he's in this asset management business, and he's opened 2 funds in Dublin. But he's got funds in other places as well. And that's actually a testament to Ireland's rather dodgy tax system rather than necessarily his hypocrisy, I think, to be fair.
Well, what I'm saying to, and it's a broader question, I mean, there's, you know, you're playing on the sovereignist idea, let's close within our warm, cuddly national atmosphere and we'll confront the world and we'll be great again. And on the other hand, you have the globalist understanding, yeah, this is the global world, you have to be on the big market if you want to play. Yeah, there are those who have lost out, but good knows somebody will take care of them, but we want to continue making our profits in the world and also asking the public at the same time to close ranks. There seems something fishy there.
There is something fishy, but there's also is a conflict between, on the one hand, those who have this idea of a kind of global buccaneering Britain as Singapore on the Thames, and that you deregulate your way to success, and on the other, the promise of the referendum, which was more money for the National Health Service, more money for public services,
which was false, as we know.
So that, in a way, the only way that you can really the only way Brexit can work economically, is that you become a regulatory rival to the European Union. If you're going for that sort of hard, independent Britain Brexit, and that essentially means the kind of state that most British people don't want to live in. There is no appetite for this very wild neoliberalism that some of these people are looking for. So there is a contradiction at the heart of Brexiteerism.
Tessa, how do you...
I think Dennis
your
is completely
pub discussions.
Right. I mean, I don't know why we are trying to disclaim hypocrisy in the case of Jacob Rees-Mogg, because that's exactly what you do. You ask the people to vote for Brexit in order to make Britain great again, and then you put your funds and your hedge funds all over the place outside. You secure both legs, the English one and the international one, because you can, because that's what this sort of aloof elite, if you want, does, and they claim to be the real Englishmen, and that's the absurd situation, which will certainly explode in their face after Brexit happens.
Forgive me, I don't want to be Jacob's lawyer, and he's perfectly able to defend himself. First of all, he doesn't run that fund. He doesn't run the company.
Well, he has interest in it.
He founded it 10 years ago, and he still owns bits of it.
Okay.
Secondly, for the last 20 years, they've had funds in Hong Kong, in Luxembourg,
of course, as one does.
Yeah, right. And they've had funds in Dublin for 10 years too, but he didn't make the decision to open a fund in Dublin, and in fact, they've more invested in the UK in the last 2 years than they have put money out of the UK. Look, he's perfectly able to defend himself, but the idea that this is hypocritical is just not true. It's really not true. Dyson, fair enough. He's moved a factory overseas. But
he has the same argument like Jacob, that it's just in the interest of business.
Draws
the facts
attention
matter.
To,
the facts do matter.
I think, well, I don't know that in this case they do, because the point is that they're all leading these investment companies. And that's what this is about. Britain has become, in the last few decades, a rentier society. We depend on income from the city. And that, you know, this has to be understood. And, you know, we look at rentier societies in other countries and they break their social contract with their citizens. This is what Brexit, in my view, is all about. It's all about being able to do these kinds of investments. And where the hypocrisy comes is, how on earth did Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson become the voice of the people? That's where the hypocrisy comes. And, you know, I don't think there's any chance that we will be the sort of regulated state that Denis says is the only way it will succeed. It's just not going to happen. And so, you know, we are going to, you know, if Brexit happens, it will go down the deregulatory route, I'm afraid. And there will be more populism as these sorts of people who have nothing to offer ordinary people in terms of jobs and employment and social security use the scapegoat card in order to win elections. That's what happens in rentier societies, and that's what happened with Brexit. That's what happened with Trump, where their manufacturing has declined and the US government is increasingly dependent on finance and on borrowing. And I think that's what we have to, you know, we do have to understand the deep roots of all this and how we can possibly move away from it.
Okay, so we've slowly come towards an end, and I'd like to do a final round, as you all predict, asking for you to look into the crystal ball on the one hand, the impossible task to predict what will happen, and we know how unpredictable it is at this very minute. But at the same time, and you have already said, Denis, what you would think is best to happen. So both a kind of realistic prediction and then a desideratum in terms of, and Prime Minister May will probably still be in office as we finish.
You never know.
I just have to say, all my predictions over the last 3 years have been wrong, so here's the one for today. Like every single one, I think, has been wrong in almost every detail. So what I think will happen is that probably Mrs. May will go in the next few days, but that her deal will not pass through Parliament this week, and as a result of that, Britain will have until April the 12th for Parliament to come up with some alternative, which it will do through a series of so-called indicative votes, where they vote on various options, and then they try to find some solution that will command a majority. I think they may not actually find that by April the 12th. And then what's supposed to happen is that you would have a summit in Brussels on, say, April 10th, and then they're supposed to have to leave on April the 12th. And I think at that summit in Brussels that the leaders will say, we are not going to force you out on April the 12th, but we will give you until May the 5th or something. But it'll be short, it'll be 2 or 3 weeks. Interestingly enough for this audience, apparently at the meeting, at the dinner on Thursday night, they were talking about when they should have the deadline. So what would be the ideal date if you were going to have a crash-out Brexit? And some of them were going for May the 22nd. And your Chancellor, apparently, was one of those who thought that would be great to have it just before the European elections, because it would show the chaos would be quite a useful political event in advance of the elections. Apparently others then said, well, actually, I think chaos mightn't be the best way to go into elections for any of us. So they then decided that was one date that they're not going to have a hard cut-off date. So anyway, so I think that probably what will happen is that having given them the second deadline, that then there will be a choice, unfortunately, unfortunately, the dream of a second referendum will have died because by April the 12th, there will be no option to extend for a long extension in the European Union. So then MPs will have to choose between some version of a Brexit deal, which would be somewhere between Mrs. May's deal and something like Norway, on the one hand, or a no-deal Brexit. And I think they will go for the deal.
Tessa.
Denis summed the easy way forward up perfectly well, I think. From all the unlikely options that we have now, because we can't even decide how unlikely each of these options is that is ahead of us, I think no deal is also in the political establishment hated. I know that Tom thinks the probability of no deal is higher, but I think it would be stopped by this parliament even at the last minute, because it's really too much damage and nobody gets out better than they are now. So I would also think that one kind of smudged deal that means a closer relationship to the European Union, like Norway style or customs union or something like that, is the most likely option from all the unlikely options at the moment.
Okay. Mary, you said the missing part here is no Brexit.
Yeah, well, I think it's very unlikely that Parliament will come up with an agreed solution before April the 12th. I don't think there's a majority for a Norway option or a common market 2.0, nor do I think there's a majority for a second referendum. What I hope will happen is not a short extension, but a long extension. At the moment, there's opposition to a long extension because it would mean participating in the European elections. I think a long extension in which we participated in the European elections could be very positive. I think these European elections, partly because of Brexit, partly because of Viktor Orban, and a whole host of other reasons, will be the first elections when there's real European engagement, when there's a real discussion about what kind of Europe we want, rather than about whether we want to be in or out. And I think the sort of European elections are a way of doing democratic politics that won't be either a national election or a referendum. And so what I think that could do would be almost the equivalent of Denis's citizens' assemblies, would be to put us into a much better position after the European elections, which would actually, I hope, shift enough MPs to be in favour of either revoking Article 50 or another referendum. I just want to add that in terms of whether we've been right or wrong, I always felt from the beginning that Brexit is simply an impossible project. There actually is no Brexit that will make us better off. There's no Brexit that will be good for Britain. And no politician has been willing to say that, Corbyn included. A Lexit would be just a disaster. And we need to be explaining this to the public, that there isn't a good Brexit. It's like divorces. There are no good divorces. People would say, oh, if only he'd said it to me nicely, or if only... But there is no way of saying these things nicely. And so there is no good Brexit. And I hope, and I think there's huge Brexit fatigue. I have a project at LSE where we study the local impacts, and we go and discuss with local people. We don't discuss leave or remain. We discuss what will be the impact, and it involves both leavers and remainers. And there is such Brexit fatigue. People are so fed up. They'd rather stay in than to keep talking for the next 10 years. So my feeling is that if only we could get over the hump of April the 12th, there is a real possibility of no Brexit.
Okay. Tom, final word from you.
Crikey. I have to say I found that description of the European elections very interesting. I think it's a possibility that it could become a very interesting election, not just in the UK, but around Europe. I don't know what the turnout in Austria is, but if it's anything like the rest of Europe, the normal turnout between 20 and 30% for European elections.
More, I think.
It's very low. I don't know if that's true here, but it's very low across the rest of the continent. And it'll be interesting to see if that figure goes up to, I mean, even 40 or 50%, let alone 60 or 70 or 80 years it would be in a general election. But what do I think's most likely to happen? I haven't got a clue. I think what we're going to do is we're going to see a range of ideas explored in the coming weeks by Parliament. I suspect they won't have a majority. The default still is to leave without an agreement, and therefore eventually there is the possibility of running out of time. And I do understand President Macron's position that he doesn't want to have a European Parliament that may or may not be legally mandated, or he doesn't want to have the doubt in it, which might then cause him to question the new Commission. So I can understand why European leaders don't want to have the UK extending by a week and a week and a week and a week, and eventually putting that into question. And so I think it remains a very strong possibility. I don't know where I'm in 50, 60% that we'll leave without an agreement at all. And I think that there are some serious challenges for that for all of us. And I mean, one of the things I've been doing over the last few years is meeting many visiting groups of parliamentarians, and it's quite striking. If you meet a group of, say, 10 Swedish parliamentarians, 9 of them will go, well, this is interesting, this Brexit thing, how's it going? And also political level. And one of them will go, there is a company in my town that employs 80% of the people and all of its trade goes to Solihull. Can you assure me that we'll have a trade deal? Because otherwise my entire town goes out of business. And every time you have a group of parliamentarians through from any European countries, there is always one who has got a particularly strong relationship, with the exception of Ireland, in which case it's all of the TDs. But this, I think, is why this challenge on how do we reconstruct a new Europe is one for all of us, and one that we're going to be talking about for the next 100 years, whether or not we do Brexit or not. So.
Well, I mean, we purposefully didn't want to go into all sorts of statistics and the intertwinedness of the UK and Europe, but the trade flows, the thousands of trucks that go through Dover, the 70% of vegetables and fruits that come from Europe to Britain during the winter time. I mean, all of these things are at a disruptive point. In a world that is experiencing seismic shocks, where the complacency of Europe to many of these events is shocking, but it's sort of stumbling out of it. The last example of that stumbling out is President Macron inviting Chancellor Merkel and President of the Commission Juncker to come and meet Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, in Paris, rather than meeting with him alone, which speaks millions to the fact that we are all, not only Huawei and 5G, we have such big things, climate change, to address. And we have this wonderful country where we have so many friends who wants to exit this, but clearly, as you said at the very beginning, Tom, there will be relations. I mean, security, you're a nuclear power. We need to share intelligence. I mean, terrorism, migration, all of these things, there will be some kinds of relations. But this is such a difficult moment in a divorce procedure, which is never easy. And clearly, I think your answer is right. No one has a clue where this is going. And so we will all be following, riveted to radios and televisions to see what happens in the next days. But I would like to thank you all for coming to Vienna, for having this debate, for stepping out of your daily grind on Brexit. And I'd like to ask the audience to join me in thanking our speakers.